Welcome to the Michigan Man Podcast on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew, for Wolverine fans from coast to coast. Go Blue and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Joining us in just a moment will be former Michigan All-American Dr. Chris Hutchinson, father of current Wolverine standout Aiden Hutchinson. Not much has changed since last week's show. Commissioner Kevin Warren issued an open letter explaining the Big Ten's decision to postpone fall athletics. That's right. He says it's not canceled, it's postponed. So what's next? The commissioner mentioned the focus was on winter or spring football taking place, but there were no details. The only other news after last week's show came from the NCAA. They are extending eligibility for all fall athletes. How that will work, no one really knows yet. As you know, Michigan and other Big Ten football players are not happy with the events of the past 2 weeks. And they are joined by a large number of players' parents from the conference seeking clarification on the president's and commissioner's decision to cancel, or again, postpone fall sports. They all want answers. What medical information was used to back up the decision? Was liability the main reason we won't have football or other fall sports? We're still short on answers. My guest today has been front and center with other Michigan moms and dads asking a lot of tough questions. Joining us next is former Michigan All-American and father of current Wolverine standout, Aiden Hutchinson. Dr. Chris Hutchinson is our game day guest on this week's edition of The Michigan Man, so stay with us. Here with us on our Game Day segment this week is someone Michigan fans, listeners to this show, need no introduction to, but we'll do one for Dr. Chris Hutchinson, former co-captain, All-American, All-Big Ten Defensive Lineman of the Year in '92, and of course is the father of current Michigan standout Aiden Hutchinson. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's been a crazy month, a crazy year, actually, for all of us sports fans in every other phase of our life. But 2 weeks ago, the Big Ten made that announcement that they were postponing fall sports. That's Kevin Warren's term, postponed. At the time, there were no details as to, specific reasons. But last week, Commissioner Warren issued an open letter, and he addressed that decision. Do you think that letter addressed the decision in a more satisfactory way?
It was a very cursory, brief, non-satisfying description. And I don't know if it was the first paragraph or so, when he basically took the paternalistic approach of don't ask about a fall season. Yeah. I forget his exact quote, but basically said, it's done, don't ask. That let off with a bad taste in my mouth almost immediately. It was like, really? You're in that position, and that's how you're going to treat the people that you just made a horrendous gaffe at? So, no, it was not satisfactory, like a bad taste in our mouths. It just was a half-hearted description and didn't change the way the parents feel, for sure.
Again, it was short on details. I'm not sure what we learned from the moment the decision was made until that open letter came out. Very short on details. Do we actually know where the Big Ten presidents were getting their medical advice to guide them in their decision?
No, we don't know who their actual committee was, per se, and what evidence they used. I was going, the research that I did on pulling the German myocarditis study was basically just stuff you get off the internet. But there's been no direct communication from the Big Ten with the general public about what materials they use to make their decision. And that's part of the problem, because in this day and age, with the ability to share information so freely, it leaves people to make guesses. And that's why we're in the position that we're in now, where everybody's second guessing whatever sort of a inadequate committee decision was made.
And that German study that you mentioned, it's been getting a lot of media exposure in the last week or so. Wasn't it found to be, according to even a couple of professors at the University of Michigan, flawed?
Lots of flaws with it. The biggest flaw is this sort of study, an observational study, where it's a fact-finding mission, and you're looking for some sort of significant trend. And then this is an exploratory only. Only then, when you start to find something, do you then dive deeper. So this sort of observational study is not meant at all. Even if it was in the same age group, which is another discussion we'll have, it's not meant to start making changes in policy and procedure and protocols. Not anyway. And if I've read some of the author's quotes, the biggest thing to me is the selection bias, which means they basically put requests or advertisements out in the public and said, if you had coronavirus or sent mailings to people that they knew had a coronavirus test, please contact us. And the lead author admitted that the majority of people that came to the study were those that said, something's not right. I don't feel normal, even though my coronavirus is negative now. Something's not right. And those were her words. And that is a completely different patient population. They knew something was wrong. This is a population that wanted answers because something was amiss, and we didn't have the ability to diagnose what it was. So you couple that with the fact that these are 50-year-old men and women in Germany with a total study population of 100, and you mix into that the statistical weaknesses, the impact. At this point, we don't really know what an MRI finding in the heart really means long term. It may be very helpful, but if I draw the analogy, if you've ever had an MRI of your back, you see disc bulges all over the place. And the vast majority of the time, it has nothing to do with your symptoms. So it's almost like the test is too sensitive for the spine, and there may be some of that component going on with the heart. You see a little bit of maybe inflammation there. And lastly, from my personal experience of taking care of over 1,000 sickest of the sick coronavirus patients at Beaumont, the incidence of myocarditis is not 78%. It's a fraction, a small fraction. And that's the sickest of the sick. And we know that most of these kids are having asymptomatic positives. So this study should have never been used. You could use it and say, hey, there's this potential out there. It's a vague potential. But if you dive any deeper than that into it, which is so surprising to me, because of the 14 chancellors and presidents, 2 of them are physicians. Now, I would assume they haven't practiced medicine in decades because of where their positions are, but clinical medicine, I should say. This is interpretation of medical literature 101 that should never have been allowed to get ground traction. But if you read some of the stories that have come out, you realize the process that Kevin Warren used, and since no one was communicating with each other and he was the go-between, you set yourself up for so many things being lost and misconstrued and misinterpreted, and that's what happened.
And it is so confusing to a layperson like me, and to anyone else who's just a fan and just does not understand what's happening. We read this study, or not read the study, but read the news surrounding the study, and say, but how does it apply to this age group of young athletes, high school, college, under 25? I don't think we just don't get it.
No, not at all. And I, as part of one of the parent organizers for the Michigan Parent Association, I sent out an email to them, and you get down to the characteristics of these, 100, average age 50-year-old male and females, just sort of off the top of my head. 20% had coronary artery disease, 20% had chronic lung disease, 20% had high cholesterol, 20% had hypertension. These are not high school and college kids. Is there some kids in college and high school that have some risks that are bigger than the average? Absolutely they do. And they need to be careful, and that's why we've instituted the opt-out ability. Mm-hmm. But this was never meant to extrapolate into anything that we see what it is now. I want to give the presidents and chancellors some sort of credit and maybe just say they were using this as a crutch to sort of say, oh, look at this. This is another sort of bad thing out there that we got to be careful of. Because if you really applied this, any logical clinical mind to this, it should have never been used in this manner at all.
Well, now that we have some medical information on this, and we're still confused as to how it applies to athletes, do you think the discussion with the Big Ten presidents was more about the liability factor involved with this?
Unfortunately, I think that was probably a big component of it. The unintended consequences of Big Ten United and the similar student-athlete group in the Pac-12 I think may have pushed this argument forward. And obviously, as a president and chancellor, you have to have a different view than an athletic director from that standpoint, because we've seen, this is modern America and people get sued all the time for all sorts of things. Most prudent lawyers would tell you, if you followed the CDC and the local guidelines and you didn't have any major deviations, the chance of you successfully being sued is extremely low. Not that, you can sue somebody for anything, but the chance of you winning when you followed all your protocols, extremely unlikely. And I will ride this horse till the end of my days. These kids are more safe in the proverbial college football bubble, which is not the NBA bubble. No way, no how, but don't kid yourself. This is a bubble. With most of their classes online, they're not mingling with the student population during class hours. They go back and forth. The camp, all our kids were in a hotel. Jim Harbaugh has pulled out all the kids from the dorms. They've given them the opportunity to stay in apartments. The sophomores who normally stay in the dorms, this is the first time that I'm aware of in modern Michigan football history that sophomores have not been required to stay in the dorms. So he has done all of these things to so much limit the impact that the student campus life. Now, that doesn't mean that 18, 20-year-old kids who yearn to be social, which is what we've seen around, couldn't potentially spread coronavirus that way from social events. But all in all, with these kids motivated and they know what this means, they are so much safer. Unless you're going to cancel, like Stanford did, no students on campus at all, then this argument of them, passing it on to each other is so much more less of a risk than it is to the general student population.
So as a physician and the father of a Michigan football player, you felt very good about the protocols that Michigan had in place.
Absolutely. I think Jim and the medical staff have done a great job, not only with the protocols, but also with keeping the parents informed. Early on, we were having every 2-week Zoom meetings about the changes and the test results and the testing itself. He went out of his way. Not to be corny, but we talked about Michigan being the leaders in best. They led the way, and I think when the Big Ten pulled back to conference only, I think that reduced the risk so much more, because I don't know if the MAC or Arkansas State has the capability to test like the Big Ten does. So I think that went a huge way, long way in promoting this safety that all the parents almost unanimously felt comfortable with. But that doesn't mean that, there wasn't some risk there, and you just have to be aware of the risk.
Well, we've heard a lot about how parents are very happy or very satisfied with the protocols that Michigan had in place. But something I guess I'm not clear on, haven't read a lot about, was the Big Ten as a conference working together on how they set up their protocols, or was everyone using their own medical advisors to do so?
That's probably my biggest issue with what happened. At least from a parent standpoint, we were not educated that everybody was following the same protocols. I think there was some base level of what the Big Ten expected, but you and I know you can have these things written down in paper, and if you're not following them in real life, they're meaningless. And I can tell you for sure, I've got videos of Aiden and Quiddy working out with masks on while they're exerting themselves, and the strength and conditioning coach is right in their face, but he's got a shield on.
Yeah.
And there's nobody around them. The hallways in Schembechler Hall all have one-way signs on them, so you don't intermix. The entrance and exit doors are now different. You walk in one door and you leave another. There's no more than 20 players in the locker room at any given time, and there's a counter at the top that tells them how many people are in there and when somebody else is free to go in. So not only did Michigan have the paper, have the protocols on paper, but they also lived it and enforced it and did a great job. So I think if the Big Ten had done a better job of this is what everybody should be following as a minimum, they did that with some testing, but they didn't really go into significant detail, at least for the parents. And then it's just upon the schools to say, listen, if you don't do a good job of enforcing this, you're only hurting yourself.
Another thing that I'm unclear on is we have all 14 schools. I think Rutgers was the only school that really was having some numbers jump up or having an issue with testing, but everyone else seemed to be doing very well. And I wonder, the presidents or whoever was looking at what the teams were doing, was someone from the committee actually interacting with the coaches, the ADs, the medical teams on these campuses and saying, okay, this is what you're doing, this is what's working? Or was there just no discussion with them at all on this matter?
From a day-to-day function, absolutely. I mean, our Michigan's medical staff was in contact with the local health departments.
Mm-hmm.
They had evaluations done by them with their protocols. Absolutely. But again, it really comes down to enforcement. You can have all the greatest rules in the world, but if they're not enforced and the kids don't embrace it and it's not from the top down, you're going to have some issues. But, listening to the other coaches in the Big Ten talk, I think that they realize that if everybody doesn't do their part, the Big Ten season is in jeopardy. So I think that was probably the biggest message that was left out there with the kids. But as we know, and talking to people very high up in the athletic department, even at Michigan, the overwhelming majority of cases did not come from any sort of athletic activities. It came from social events. And then they would pass to each other in their living arrangements, those sorts of things. And we know that from Rutgers. We know that from LSU. We know that from Indiana. All of these were social events that happened. So again, this only reinforces my point that you keep them with the football mindset, and they have to get up at 8 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning, whatever it is. I think Aiden was at the building at 6:30 this morning. That's going to take away from their sort of desire, if you will, to go out and stay out late. And obviously, the freshmen and people that aren't going to make as big of an impact are a little less likely in the real world to sort of not want to go explore, especially freshmen. I mean, they're away from their family. This is a very important time in their life to grow emotionally and socially. So I'm not discounting the fact that there's going to be breaches, but compared to the general population, if you're having students on campus, no one is safer than the athletes.
Well, on Friday, this past Friday, you and your wife, along with other Big Ten parents, met in Rosemont, Illinois, at Big Ten headquarters. Got a lot of coverage, of course, on BTN. Was there a chance to meet or talk with anyone in Big Ten administration?
No, we were actually told last night. We have a Zoom meeting with parents from most of the other Big Ten schools, and we were told that most of the staff at the Big Ten headquarters were sent home. As you can tell, they were having the potential for a very large gathering because they had shut the road down. There was police, there was ambulance. They weren't sure what to expect. So they just, as a safety precaution, they're like, you know what, just stay home. So no, we had no interaction with everyone. I actually wasn't there. I had to work in the morning, but my wife flew out with my mother-in-law first thing Friday morning.
Okay.
We got there and did some interviews and met with a bunch of other parents and from alliances, and we've been sharing information. But no one reached out to us, which has been their sort of status quo. I mean, the presidents are even worse. They have been radio silent. There's been a few athletic directors that have made statements, Iowa, Penn State, Michigan State, but no one has. It's baffling to me that they're so silent, almost like they're preparing to get sued because they don't want to say anything that's going to be held against them later. I mean, it's been zero from Schlissel's office.
Well, we've had several player petitions that have surfaced since the postponement of the season, and I guess most notably the one started by Justin Fields from Ohio State, and a lot of Michigan players have joined with him. Do you know if anyone in a decision-making position within the Big Ten has even made an attempt to talk to them?
Not that I've heard, but that doesn't mean that it didn't have an impact. I saw a quote last night that, and I'm not sure who the one that supplied the quote was, but it was someone that alleges that they talked directly to Warren, and Warren recognizes that he made a big mistake and did not anticipate the level of engagement that the Big Ten players and families would have with respect to postponing the season. So I think he made a big miscalculation there as far as, us accepting him saying this is what we're going to do and that's it.
Another thing that a lot of us as fans are unclear on is how much involvement the NCAA had in the Big Ten, Pac-12, or MAC decisions. I didn't read or hear much about it. As far as you know, Chris, were they involved at all, or did they just leave it to the conferences and the states?
Honestly, it's almost akin to what happened in our country in general. If you want to look at the federal government versus the NCAA, they were very hands-off and let it up to the local, municipalities or conferences or states to deal with it themselves. It was eerie the way that happened. And I've heard, I don't understand the details of this, but I don't think the NCAA has a lot of jurisdiction over what's been happening. Yeah. Obviously, they control the rules and regulations in the NCAA tournament, but from when they start, how many games they're going to have, what their protocols are, I think the NCAA is very limited. And so as far as I've been made aware, the NCAA has had very little impact. I think it's better governed by people that are in a local, we know what we like. We've seen this in high school football. Some school districts in Pennsylvania, despite the fact that their state organization said, yeah, we're going to play anyway, they weren't comfortable with it. There's a lot to be said about keeping it close to the people. Because, if the NCAA came down, all you're going to have is the people just complain about the NCAA. At least the Big Ten is closer to us, and we can, have maybe some impact there. The NCAA is, the federal government way off in a far, far land, and we can't touch them. So I'm almost okay with it. But again, just like the federal government, I wish they would have had more involvement and oversight and facilitation as much as they're allowed to. And I think that would have gone a long way to solidify. Listen, this is slightly off topic, but I have said this repeatedly. I think this decision by the Big Ten it could possibly be the right decision. One, it was premature in most people's minds. Two, they did an awful job of keeping people in the loop, being transparent, even remotely transparent. I think they could have had the very same decision had they waited, had they provided more information to us. And I don't think we would be in this discussion where, the parents and the students and many fans are pitted against the Big Ten and the presidents. I honestly believe that. If you engage people and you say, this is why we made our decisions, we're not comfortable with it, this is the risk, I think people would have taken that a long way. But when you say nothing and behave the way that the Big Ten did and the commissioner did, I think you're just asking for contempt.
No, absolutely. I agree with that. And, I think that leads to, one of the questions I get from my listeners. They say, look, if the season was postponed for the health and welfare of the student athletes, why are we turning around now and saying we're working on a winter or spring season that would mean something like 18 games in a calendar year? I don't know how that you would slice it up, but let's say at least 18 games in the next calendar year for these same student athletes. Does that even make sense?
Well, I think there's a lot to unwrap there. I think from the proposals that I've heard, they're talking about an 8-game season. And if you have it in the winter, I think that's the lesser of the two evils, if you will. A spring season, I think that really comes with a lot of baggage. If you get the season done by end of February, early March, you have May, June, July. I think that's more acceptable, and you don't play, 12 games. I think 8 games is okay. But I think it's a far cry. I'd rather play 6 games in the fall than 8 games in the winter or spring.
As the father of a Michigan football player, a physician, you don't see any problem with the demands that puts on these young guys physically?
Physically, no. I think there's certainly some drawbacks, and there's going to be unintended consequences. Normally, in a routine college football season, for example, third week of the year, you tear your ACL, you're ready to play the next year. You do that in the second or third game in January, you're going to miss another season.
Yeah.
So I think these are things that at least to how the NCAA interfaces with the Big Ten, is these are the things that they can help with. You get another redshirt year, you get, some sort of thing to help. It's not going to be a lot, but there's going to be students like that. And my stance on what's going to be different between the fall and the winter or spring has changed slightly. Just the same reason the Big Ten should have waited to make their decision. We saw the very next Saturday, the FDA gave emergent approval to the saliva test.
Right.
And from what I understand, from what I've read, this has the ability to be a game changer. From what I understand, if you look past the German myocarditis study, the biggest overall issue was the testing. Now, Michigan, can we afford to send it to an outside lab? Absolutely. But those outside labs, they're slow. They're 3 to 5 days. We need to have the ability. The protocol as it was set up going forward before everything got postponed was we were going to be tested on Thursday afternoon. So you knew if you were the road team, that everybody that made the trip had at least tested negative 24 hours before. The presidents, from what I've been told, would be much more comfortable if we had a relatively rapid test that you could test either Friday night or Saturday morning, 4 or 5 hours before game day. I agree. That would be great if you can do that. And that would add another layer of protection. But I think you have to be very careful. I mean, we have just seen what's happened in the NFL. They had 80 false positives in in a New Jersey lab,
right?
And they had to repeat those. So you would have to be very careful how you roll this out because there's going to be false positives, and you have to have the ability to repeat another test and not basically take this kid off competition for 2 weeks. You've got to have the facilities to be able to make these adjustments on the fly because we know with any test there's false positives and false negatives. And both of them, both false negatives and positives, have a detrimental effect. And I think for everybody that's involved, for the student athletes, for the protection and mitigation, you have to have protocols in place that say, listen, if they're a positive and we think this is a false positive, we need to be able to retest. We need to have enough time for these results to be able to move forward. We saw that here in Michigan with Matt Stafford. He was on the quarantine or the COVID list, and they tested him, 3 or 4 times after his ultimately false positive test. We saw this in Northwestern. They shut down their training over the summer, and it was a false positive. So you've got to be very careful. These tests are very helpful, but they are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination.
A lot of college football players, let's say, Aiden among them, have to make a decision about their future. Should they stay, or in some cases graduate, or in other cases make themselves available for the NFL draft. And that has just got to be a very unexpected and gut-wrenching decision, Chris.
It's a very personal decision. Obviously, we've had 2 players at Michigan that have already declared for the draft. I hope they haven't burned their bridges and done things with agents that limit their eligibility because honestly, I think a winter season, I don't think that harms your draft stock. You're going to get some junior film under your belt for those that are juniors. Michigan has set up basically an NFL combine on October 24th that is, I hope, and that's what Jim's thoughts were, I believe, that if we do have a winter-spring season and these kids aren't available for the actual NFL combine, I mean, there's going to be NFL scouts there. This thing's going to be streamed. There's going to be every procedure, every test that they do at the combine, except for the Wonderlic, they're going to be doing them there. And I think that's a huge advantage because now the kid's like, listen, I've got film of my 40. It's not an electronic 40 and held to the exact same standards, but they get a feel for how fast you are. And they know what your leap and all these different measures that they use. And if that means that I'm still playing a football game in the end of February when the NFL Combine is, listen, I've already had a combine. You know what I'm capable of. And if I have a spectacular year, and I think it's appropriate for, as a personal decision as a student athlete to, take that risk of, some people are fine going second or third round. Others, they want to be first rounders, and that's all they're going to come out for if they're, believe that they're solidly in the first round. But whatever your decision is, at least from a Michigan standpoint and a winter season, I don't really think that harms them that much. I think the biggest harm is if Michigan doesn't play at all, and the Big Ten doesn't play at all, and the other schools do. Then you've got kids that are in the same class, juniors and seniors. One group of them has junior-senior film, the other one does not. And that is an enormous disadvantage, and it's going to hurt them immensely. If you can get done in end of February, honestly, the NFL draft's not till the end of April. They normally, and from what I've heard, they have some wiggle room. I don't know how much wiggle room they really have in the timing of the combine. And I'll be honest, I don't think there's going to be, we're going to be in a very similar situation that we are right now. Not as bad as we were after the draft last year, but I don't know if they're going to really be flying kids all over the place to the degree that they used to be, because they're still concerned. I mean, they haven't even let the NFL scouts go out in the field yet.
Right.
So that was one of the issues with making this October 24th. We tried to push it back as far as possible so the NFL would release the scouts to be there in person to see these kids and interact with these kids to increase their exposure.
Well, Chris, as of right now, Big 12, ACC, the SEC, and I think Conference USA are all forging ahead, as we are well aware. And I think what's puzzling is they have medical advisors giving them input too. And it's really hard for us to understand why their medical teams say, let's move ahead safely and try to play. And the Big Ten pulled the plug in early August. I mean, you're on the front lines, you're a physician. How can you explain that?
Well, again, I think there's a lot of layers to this. First and foremost, just like your car repairman, you bring your car in for an issue to 3 different used car repairmen. They're going to give you're liable to get different decisions. And while the same thing happens in medicine, my bigger thought on what went into the differing opinions about the research that's out there, specifically about myocarditis, is risk tolerance. I know there was an SI article about this, and I think there's a lot to that. I think there is differing risk tolerance out there and risk assessments. I believe with what Dr. Ackerman, the prominent cardiologist who counseled the leagues that are playing, I think this is an issue to consider, but it should not be the issue or a major issue to cancel a season. I think that the Pac-12, from what I understand, is even more conservative than the Big Ten, but they were much more proactive about sharing with their constituents the protocols and the evidence that they use. And, they put out a 12-page document describe their decision-making process.
Well, Chris, even if we do have a vaccine by next year, I know that will play big into the planning for the spring and the summer, but that's one of those things a lot of experts say there might be a vaccine ready, and then another segment of the medical community says it could take years for a vaccine to be developed. Do you think college football, sports in general, at the high school and college level, I should say, is going to take years after this to get back to normal, whatever happens?
I think there's a possibility. And then to take that even further, what's this doing to our recruiting as a conference? I mean, as well as I do, that those other schools, if they have a successful campaign, Big Ten, you may not even play football. And that resonates. Now, is the opposite possibly true? Because I know from talking to our 130-plus parents that there are some parents that do not want to play. And that may appeal to a percentage of people, absolutely. But the majority of the football people, that's going to be a negative recruiting tactic, which has the potential to hurt our conference for years to come.
Final question for you, Chris, and this is one that I get all the time. And given everything that we've discussed and everything that's been in the news in the last 2 weeks, a lot of pressure on the Big Ten commissioner, on the presidents. Do you see it even being a remote possibility they will reverse their decision?
No, while I know that a lot of my parents want that to happen, and I would want that to happen, and I think there's still time for it, I would feel fine. An 8-game fall season is better than an 8-game spring or winter season.
Yeah.
But this is me just summarizing and interpreting all that I have heard and read, that I think they are banking and holding their breath that the other conferences are going to fail and they will be vindicated. They're putting a lot of stock into that. And I grew up in Houston. I grew up in Texas, and I know what Texas football is like.
Mm-hmm.
They want their football. They understand the importance of football, not even as its own individual sport, but as we can tell from what just happened in Iowa, they're starting to make comments about cutting swimming and diving and all these other sports. People don't recognize that you've now canceled the season, and now you're going to have to start, I don't know what happens to their scholarship for the swimming and diving team in Iowa. What happens to the coaches? Are they all just fired? I mean, how does this even happen? And these are just the ripples downstream from football not playing. It's not just about football. We recognize that at most schools, football and basketball probably at the most are the only two revenue sports, and everybody else on there is reliant on that money. And now something's got to change. I mean, I can't even recall, but there was a lot of Stanford sports that were eliminated, men and women. I don't think that's right, and I think they could have avoided a lot of that. And obviously Michigan financially is in a better place than probably just about every other school in the Big Ten, save Ohio State. But it's going to hurt. Don't kid yourself. This is going to be a painful process, and they're going to have to make cuts. And I'm not sure that we had to be here. But again, back to the root of your question is I think that the other leagues are going to power through, and unless there is a major problem, there is going to be kids in the SEC that get coronavirus and they have to be quarantined and contact tracing and all of those things. But you knew that going into this. You weren't going to have a pristine, I don't have a single case involved. It's not going to happen. So as long as you're prepared for that and you're not, gun shy, you're okay with that. Now, if you get it and the whole team has to postpone a couple of games, then, well, that's a problem, because this isn't baseball where you can play multiple games in a week and make those up like the MLB is going to have to do. But I think that the Big Ten, in my opinion, has hitched their wagon to they're going to fail and we're going to end up looking like the smartest conference in the room when it's all said and done. To me, it's a double-edged sword for me. I want them to be successful, the other conferences, because then I believe that will force the Big Ten to have a winter or spring season. If they fail, I think the Big Ten will pull the plug on the spring or winter season. I don't mean to be sort of bombastic about this. I think that was to placate us. No, listen, we're going to postpone this, and you've got the spring season to worry about, and so now we can all focus on that. They didn't do their due diligence. They didn't say, listen, these are, if you wanted me to believe what you said, you would have already investigated this and had a temporary plan in place moving forward. Listen, we don't think it's advisable to play in the fall. Here's what we're going to do in the spring. But no, they didn't do that. They threw it out there as this pie in the sky, vague issue. We still could postpone it till the winter or spring. Not buying it. I think it's, even the way it is now, I think it's uncommon that we're going to have a winter or spring. I hope I'm wrong, but I just don't. I hope not. I hope the testing improves, and I hope that's enough to get them over the hump to make that decision. But, I grew up during the Bo era, and we know Bo's interactions with the school president, and I have no faith in them making a decision that's based on how we feel. They have a different set of values and beliefs and processes, which frequently, at least in my experience, has not really correlated with what happens down in Shem.
With us on our Game Day segment this week has been former Michigan defensive lineman, now Dr. Chris Hutchinson, who works at Beaumont Hospital in Royal Oak in the emergency room. And again, all of my listeners, Michigan fans, know who you are. And of course, we've been hearing a lot from you in recent weeks. And that's why we invited you on the show and help us understand from a former player's perspective and a father, Aiden Hutchinson's dad, what's been going on behind the scenes for the last couple of weeks. So, Chris, we appreciate you carving out some time in what we know is a busy schedule for you. Hopefully we can get back together in the future and talk, and maybe COVID-19 won't even be a topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk about maybe a Big Ten championship in the winter. How about that? That'd be great.
I look forward to that discussion. So, Chris, once again, thanks for your time, and you take care.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thanks again to Dr. Chris Hutchinson for being our guest today. He is uniquely qualified to discuss this situation, and I hope you enjoyed his insight. Remember to like us on Facebook and Twitter. Wherever you get the show from, please rate or comment on us, and we welcome the feedback. Thank you in advance. If you have any ideas for future guests on the show, or just have something on your maize and blue mind, please email me anytime at the Michigan Man Podcast at yahoo.com. That's the Michigan Man Podcast at yahoo.com. I look forward to hearing from you. That will do it for another show. Next week, we hope to have beat writer Nick Baumgartner drop by for a visit. So tell your friends and family about the show, and make sure you join us again next week. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Have a great Wolverine week, everyone. Until we meet again, take care, and as always, go blue. Thanks for joining us today on The Michigan Man, here on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew. Our listener lines are open 24/7 for your calls at 313-263-4842. That's 313-263-4842. Or email us at the Michigan Man Podcast at yahoo.com. That's the Michigan Man Podcast at yahoo.com. The Michigan Man Podcast is produced at the studios of Robin Lynn Productions, Allen Park, Michigan, and is not affiliated with the University of Michigan. Go Blue!